And so the idea was, okay, you're more likely to persuade them that this is workable, that this is viable, and it's actually in their self-interest if they want borrowers not to default and repay them back. But the way to do that was to establish this as a norm.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. Some of the most heavily indebted countries in the world are also the ones most vulnerable to climate-induced natural disasters. And when a hurricane, cyclone, or massive drought hits a country, officials can be faced with the choice of either servicing their debts or paying for disaster recovery. As the pace and scale of natural disasters increases due to climate change, some policy entrepreneurs have introduced the idea of including so-called pause clauses in loan agreements. These would enable the country to suspend debt payments for a period of time as the country recovers from a natural disaster. The best-known champion of this idea is the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mottley. This was a signature proposal among a suite of reforms to international financing policies for climate-vulnerable countries known as the Bridgetown Initiative. My guest today, Michael Sheldrick, tells the story of how pause clauses went from an idea on paper to a policy now widely implemented by the World Bank. He's the author of the new book, From Ideas to Impact, a playbook for influencing and implementing change in a divided world. Michael Sheldrick is also co-founder of Global Citizen, a worldwide grassroots campaign dedicated to ending extreme poverty, and Global Citizen is probably best known for holding concert festivals and other high-profile events alongside major international meetings like the UN General Assembly. Now, the book covers much more than pause clauses, but it is what we focus on in our conversation today because I think it is such a good example of policy entrepreneurship in the face of a seemingly intractable problem. Today's episode is a good example of solutions journalism, an approach to some of these great global questions that I strive to take on Global Dispatches that seeks to not just dwell on the problem, but offer policy solutions to the problem, and pause clauses certainly fits the bill. As always, please feel free to reach out to me using the contact button on globaldispatches.org. I love to hear from you. Send me your recommendations of people I should interview, books I should read, topics I should cover. I always love your feedback. Now here is my conversation with Michael Sheldrick, author of From Ideas to Impact, a playbook for influencing and implementing change in a divided world, and co-founder of Global Citizen. So, Mick, thanks so much for speaking with me. So we're actually going to be focusing much of our conversation on one story you tell in your book about the Bridgetown Initiative and so-called pause clauses. But I happen to be catching you in Bridgetown. What are you doing there this time around?
Thanks, Mark. Real pleasure to be on the program. This is my third trip to Barbados. It is a special trip because I've also got my wife and 6-month-old baby in tow. We'll be seeing the Prime Minister, Mottley, tonight as we prepare to launch the third iteration of the Bridgetown Initiative. And on Saturday, I'm very privileged and humbled to be given a talk about the book at the Bridgetown Museum and Historical Society. So a number of things, but also just, it's a fabulous place, lots of great food. So just trying to take a bit of a rest with the family as well.
It's a working vacation. You're meeting the Prime Minister, giving a book talk, and presumably hanging out on the beach. So all good. You mentioned the third iteration of the Bridgetown Initiative. Before we discuss the Bridgetown Initiative in general and pause clauses in particular, can I have you set the scene and explain the problem that the Bridgetown Initiative and pause clauses are intended to solve?
So I first met Prime Minister Mottley back in 2019. And that was the first time she came to Central Park during UN Leaders Week, and she addressed the Global Citizen Festival. And look, she's not the first, and unfortunately, she won't be the last leader of a climate vulnerable country to talk about the impacts of climate change on a country like hers. But part of the reason why I think she's been so successful, along with multiple partners, getting this issue on the global agenda is because it's anchored in very actionable solutions. But if I start first with the problem is you've got many countries who weren't responsible for the impacts of climate change, but are not only on the front lines of those impacts, whether that's droughts, whether that's flooding, whether that's hurricane, whether that's wildfires, everywhere from here in the Caribbean to Malawi. But many of these countries are also amongst some of the most indebted nations in the world. I think Barbados at one stage was ranked third in terms of one of the most indebted countries in the world. And so they find themselves, if you're hit by one of these climate-induced natural disasters, you have to basically take out more debt in order to respond. And then you find yourself in this horrible debt cycle in which you're unable to get out of, right? And so the whole point behind the Bridgetown Initiative is, how do you change the financial system to free up financial resources so that countries such as Barbados, but also other climate vulnerable countries, I mentioned Malawi, in Zambia, Kenya, many countries that are experiencing these impacts right now as we speak, how do you give them the resources to be able to not just transition to clean energy, but be able to withstand natural disasters and indeed thrive? How do you have the money to be able to build that resilience? And just very practically, I think over a year ago, when Cyclone Freddie, which was the longest living cyclone in the history of humanity, hit Malawi, and I think it sat on the country for over 48 hours, killed 1,200 people, destroyed 2 million farms, put 5 million people on the brink of starvation. At that time, the country was paying more than a quarter of its annual revenue in repaying its debt. It was paying more in debt repayments than it was in terms of being able to build hospitals, provide education, provide meals, let alone rebuild after a natural disaster. And so the Bridgetown Initiative was like, how do you address these issues? And one practical example of that was this idea of a debt pause clause. Now, a debt pause clause is basically the idea that if your country is hit by one of these natural disasters, automatically you get a 2-year break on repaying any debt, right? You're suspended, you're not penalized for it, and you can put that money, instead of repaying loans, basically into your response and rebuilding.
Yeah, like normally, if you stop repaying debts, you'd go into default, and that would hurt your credit rating, make borrowing more expensive in the future. But the idea here is that if your country is struck by a natural disaster, you can have a temporary reprieve from paying those debts back and instead invest in rebuilding your country after the disaster.
Exactly, 100%. And so in the case of Barbados, right, if all of its loans were paused, if it faced hypothetically a hurricane, that would unlock the equivalent of, I think, 700 million US dollars, which is about 15% of the size of its economy. And that money is far greater than any amount of humanitarian aid. Now, the challenge is when this idea was first floated, and I remember having a conversation with the Prime Minister, Mottley, back in 2022. And just for the record, and she would be clear about this as well, it was actually Guyana who first experimented with this idea of debt pause clauses, in which the Prime Minister kind of picked it up and ran with it to popularize. But when she first told me about it, of course, you go to Wall Street, you go to the commercial banks, and you laughed right out of it. They're like, this is never going to happen. This is fanciful. And so the whole idea behind the Bridgetown Initiative, and there were many asks, but one of them was to get multilateral creditors like the World Bank and other lenders, official creditors like the US Treasury, to be amongst the first to commit to introduce these clauses into loan agreements with countries like Barbados and Malawi.
So you have this like very concrete ask, an idea that Guyana originated, but Mia Mottley and Barbados kind of ran with for pause clauses embedded in loan agreements with presumably the World Bank specifically. So how do you go from having that idea to implementing that idea, to getting the political capital behind that idea? And you tell the story in your book how it really is like the personality and the ingenuity of Mia Mottley that helped bring this idea to life. Like, what made her so unique in this regard in advancing this idea?
So I think there's really 6 key insights or lessons that you could take from the Prime Minister leadership. And by the way, she's always the first to say that Bridgetown is much more than Barbados. It's really this coalition and it's this call to action. But of course, she is the spirit of it, if you like. And I think there's 6 key lessons to take away. The first is just being focused and having a very singular emphasis on your policy goal. And she was like, these pause clauses is something we're going to focus on. And I still remember being at the United Nations. I think it was the second meeting of the Bridgetown Initiative. The Secretary General was there. This was taking place in New York a little over a year ago. And of course, everyone has thrown out their wish list. And you'd appreciate this. And I've been guilty of this in the past. Anyone in our world, I think anyone that advocates for the Sustainable Development Goals, we tend to want a lot, right? And we tend to ask for everything at once. We present a wish list. And I remember her saying, simplicity gets us to the end. The minute we ask for everything at once, the game is up, right? And so I think the first key takeaway was just the focus on this is something which we can win.
It's like focused enough. It's concrete enough. It's not everything under the sun, but it's one very digestible, understandable policy goal.
Exactly. And it's not to say everything else isn't important, but you have these moments in time where you're going to say, okay, we're going to really focus on this. And this brings me to the second key element. That was mastering the art of timing. Because a little over a year ago, of course, at the World Bank, you had David Malpass, Ajay Banga's predecessor. He was really hounded out the job because of the likes of Greta Thunberg and Al Gore.
Yeah, Al Gore ended his job. Basically, Malpass was a Trump appointee who it turned out was like a climate denier. And the World Bank's key focus, ostensibly, is climate resilience. And the two just didn't mesh. So he left.
Exactly. So, of course, Ajay Banga comes in and he really feels this pressure to burnish his climate credentials, right? And of course, for the World Bank to do a lot, it needs the support of its shareholders. If it's going to spend more, it needs a lot. The benefit of this idea of pause clauses, you're not actually asking it to put in new money. You're saying in your existing loan agreements and in future loan agreements, can you introduce these natural disaster clauses? And by the way, this actually increases the likelihood that countries won't default and they will actually be able to pay back, right? It was an idea that you could describe as low-hanging fruit, but it was like, okay, this is an idea whose time has come. And if you're looking for something to burnish your climate credentials, this could be a good idea. So second point was just mastering the art of timing. The third point I would say with the Prime Minister that she excelled at was leveraging the strength of others. Now, the Prime Minister is obviously the leader of a sovereign state. That gets her in the room with the likes of Biden, Rishi Sunak, and other key world leaders, right? But she would also be the first to say that she would come to the World Bank and often not be given an equal seat at the table. I remember at the World Bank spring meetings last year, decried the fact that she would have to almost go on the outside to have her message heard and didn't have that platform. And I think what she did by reaching out with groups like Global Citizen and partnering with us, she said, I need the support of citizens. I need the support of popular culture. And I remember being in the room when she was on the phone to Billie Eilish's mum, saying if Billie Eilish cares about climate change, she also needs to stand for those countries on the front lines of the climate crisis. And of course, the Prime Minister being a Bayesian, One of the other more famous Bayesians is Rihanna, right? And of course, getting Rihanna to tweet the likes of Janet Yellen, Secretary of the Treasury, RJ Banga, also helps. But how do you inspire citizens? And global citizen, we have 12 million citizens around the world. This really brings us to, I think, the fourth element, and that is mastering the art of storytelling. And really, it's to the Prime Minister's credit in building a coalition that she's able to make these issues relevant, not just to her people, but people around the world. And I remember her saying during the pandemic, people in America, if they were facing difficulties repaying their mortgages or their rents or their student loans, there was the ability that was built in to have those loan repayments suspended for a period of time, right? To have some form of relief. And she said, why shouldn't countries also have that? It's the same principle, right, that she was applying here. And so I think being able to make it relevant to people around the world really positioned her as a leader in the climate movement. And, last year there was images, Listen to Mia, she became this iconic figure that spoke for, I think, the aspirations of far more than the 300,000 citizens of Barbados. And then I think you bring to the fifth principle, and this is this idea of pragmatic idealism, which I guess I've already touched on, but where I really saw this play out is the Prime Minister is acutely aware that if you're to influence change, it requires engaging people who you may not 100% agree with all the time. And in this regard, she managed to convince President Emmanuel Macron of the G7 to host a big summit last year that took place in June, a summit for a new financing pact.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think there was an element that she said, like, okay, if he organizes this, if he brings the finance chiefs together of all the big institutions, including the World Bank, she would publicly praise him, right? Even if it made her unpopular in the process. And I remember this one acute moment last year, the night before this summit in Paris, beautiful summer night. Global Citizen had organized a huge event, 20,000 people. You had Billie Eilish, Lenny Kravitz, and you actually had the Prime Minister on stage with RJ Banga, who was going to make this announcement that he would introduce pause clauses into new loan agreements with 12 climate vulnerable countries, right? Mostly small island nations. And I remember, despite the fact that the crowd was clearly calling for Macron to resign, right?
Not the most popular politician in France at the time.
Exactly. And she stared them down. And I remember she said, my friends, and you can see this on YouTube, it's available. She said, my friends,
trust me. I want you to know that the one person in the G7 who has stood up for the planet has been President Macron. So whether we like it or not, that's our reality.
And she might, behind the scenes, have had her own private criticisms, but that idea of private candor, public support is something she really imbued, saying, if we want to create change, it's going to require us bringing people together. And I guess, the final point, like I mentioned, there was 6 points, is, okay, well, once you've got these promises and you have the likes of RJ Banga on stage saying, I'm going to introduce this into loan agreements with 12 countries, you've got the US Treasury, you've got the UK Treasury, or suddenly saying, we're going to do that too. How do you actually make sure talk turns into action, right? To your question, idea turns into impact. And, really she had a degree of tenacity in terms of accountability, in that she wouldn't let it go. And I can tell you, being in rooms with the Prime Minister, she has such attention to detail. And over the course of the next 6 months, it wasn't until COP28 in Dubai that really that commitment from RJ Banga was crystallized, not only in terms of 12 countries, it was extended to 45 climate vulnerable countries. And additionally, and this was the key sticking point, it wasn't just a future loan agreements, but it was going to be applied retrospectively to existing loan agreements.
That was going to be my next question for you.
And just to put that in perspective, that is the equivalent of $9 billion worth of loans from the World Bank alone, which, if triggered all at once, would unlock the equivalent of $500 million. And of course, It was the Bridgetown Initiative, the Prime Minister pushing that led to that. But I think it's, at the end of the day, stuff only matters if you can land the plane, right? And actually make a difference for vulnerable people. And in this case, I think you can say, well, this is what the Bridgetown Initiative has already achieved in terms of reform of the World Bank.
So I'm glad that you made that connection between turning pledges into actually implemented policy, because so many times around the UN, you see pledges made, but the follow through never actually happens. This is one case in which the follow through definitely did happen. We have this reform at the World Bank in which these pause clauses are now not only included in new loan contracts, but retroactively, as you said, in 45 countries. But of course, the World Bank is only one part, not even the biggest part, of loans that climate vulnerable countries take out around the world. Their private sector is probably even larger. Is there efforts underway, or how would you describe efforts underway to get those similar pause clauses embedded in other private loan contracts in climate vulnerable countries?
Really, it was twofold. It was the idea that you're exactly right. You have really three types of creditors, right? Multilateral creditors like the World Bank, private sector creditors, commercial banks. And then you also have official bilateral creditors like China and the US, probably being the first and foremost, the largest, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the reason why we collectively decided to focus on the World Bank and multilateral institutions was they are still the single largest source of financing when it comes to many of these countries. When you look at Malawi, etc., collectively, and that's not just the World Bank, that could be the African Development Bank, it could be the Inter-American Development Bank. And it was also a recognition that when you look at some of the needs of countries when it comes to funding adaptation and climate resilient infrastructure, the reality is it's going to be very hard to finance that through commercial debt, right? A lot of that's going to need to come from concessional financing, of which multilateral creditors like the World Bank is the largest source. So I think it was a recognition that in establishing existing debt, yes, was one piece, but it was also recognizing that you were creating a norm of which multilateral lending will increasingly become a bigger source of financing, especially if the other asks of the Bridgetown Initiative are adopted and implemented. But you're exactly right that many of these countries also have high degrees of commercial debt, right? And so the idea was, okay, you're more likely to persuade them that this is workable, that this is viable, and it's actually in their self-interest if they want borrowers not to default and repay them back. But the way to do that was to establish this as a norm. It was going to be very hard to, say, convince Wall Street to take the lead here because they brutally just care about return on investment, right? Whether you like Wall Street or not, that's my wife's worked in finance for many years. She worked for an investment bank. I've learned a lot about it. And I know that they look at numbers at the end of the day and they work at whether these instruments work. And so, that's certainly the next piece. One thing I would say on official creditors is you did have this flurry of countries committing, like the UK, the US, France, Germany, and many others. And you had other multi-development banks also committing in the 6 months since that commitment in June last year. I would just also say that in terms of unfinished business, we talk about the triggering event, right? In this case, natural disasters or climate-induced natural disasters that would trigger these clauses and the suspension of debt repayments, right? There is unfinished work in that this shouldn't just be applied to climate-related natural disasters. There is a view that it should also be applied to a pandemic, and it should also even maybe be applied to famine as well. And there's all sorts of different literature. There's groups who have done studies on how you would measure that and how something would be considered a triggering event. Of course, with a pandemic, you could have something like a declaration by the WHO, but much of the debt countries face in response to climate change obviously was piled on through the pandemic as well. And that includes getting the World Bank and other similar institutions to also extend their view of what should trigger a pause clause.
One thing I find particularly unique about pause clauses as a solution to the problem of debt-burdened countries is that it's unique in the sphere of global development in that it can apply to both low-income countries and so-called middle-income countries, of which, Barbados is one. At the World Bank, as you know, as I'm sure many listeners know, there's like a suite of concessional vehicles, loan vehicles available to the poorest countries in the world that aren't necessarily available to climate vulnerable so-called middle income countries like Barbados. And this is one of those platforms that I think that is like uniquely applicable across a variety of different countries.
Yeah, I think that's right. And Prime Minister Mottley really summarizes the distinction as such. You've got countries that are already poor, and you've got countries that will be pushed into poverty as a result of climate change, right? And obviously, Barbados falls into the latter category. And I think this was really learning from the fact that if you remember during the pandemic, there was an attempt to institute a process through the World Bank and the G20. It was called the DSSI initiative, right? And it was this kind of clunky process of countries could go through to have their debt repayment suspended. But it took too long. It was very convoluted. And the idea with this, picking up the innovation of the pause clause, and a gentleman at the International Peace Institute described this to me as probably one of the biggest policy innovations and breakthroughs of 2023, was that it's automatic, right? If you can get into these loan agreements, regardless of whether they're poor countries or countries that will be poor in future because of climate change, it will be triggered automatically, and you get that instant relief and fiscal space, as Prime Minister Mottley says. But I do think you touch on a bigger issue, and this has come up a few times through the process of Bridgetown Initiative and indeed building support. And I would point out that Prime Minister Mottley is about to succeed President Akufo-Addo of Ghana as the chair of the V20, which is this group of, I think, 60 plus countries now who identify as climate vulnerable. But you do have this question of, okay, you've got low income countries, you've got middle income countries, and you have this tension often that others will say, well, are they robbing Peter to pay Paul, right? And what the Bridgetown Initiative will say, and what it puts very clearly, is no. Like, many of its proposals is actually about increasing fiscal space for all countries if its reforms were adopted. One of the concerns of the Prime Minister, and you hear this not just from her, but other leaders across the Caribbean and the Pacific in particular, is that institutions that give a concessional financing currently use only one measure, and that is the size of a GDP, right, per capita. Are you high income, middle income, low income? And what they will tell you is, what good is that? The Prime Minister uses the analogy of, that's like saying last year, I'm taking your blood pressure, right? And, what good is a blood pressure test from a year ago? And what she means by that is saying, I could be a high middle income country yesterday, and then a hurricane could wipe away my entire economy. And for the rest of that, I have no economy or no revenue. And so you see attempts to introduce this notion of climate vulnerability into eligibility criterion that these institutions use to basically say, okay, let's measure if a country is vulnerable to climate change, not just where they are on a per capita index, and accord finance in that way. And of course, through the UN right now, you have this process called the MVI process. I think it stands for the Multi-Vulnerability Index, right? Which is this whole idea of ranking countries according to a number of indicators that goes into a country's vulnerability to external shocks.
So at the outset of our conversation, you mentioned that you are in Bridgetown for the third meeting of the Bridgetown Initiative. You've already secured this concrete policy win around pause clauses. What's next under the rubric of the Bridgetown Initiative in terms of concrete policy proposals, policy wins that you're looking towards?
So I think it's important to recognize that Bridgetown Initiative, it brings together multiple stakeholders. It's got leaders like the Prime Minister, it's got civil society organizations like Global Citizen, and it also has philanthropic support as well. I mean, it's a multitude of stakeholders that are involved, plus very smart experts and academics, far smarter than I am on the technical side. And it's really responsive to the changes. So currently, like there was Bridgetown 1.0, where you had this great push around the debt pause clauses. Then you had Bridgetown 2.0. And so currently it's saying, okay, we've got this period of time where we've got Brazil, for instance, hosting the G20 later this year and COP30 next year. You have these opportunities, right, building on the reforms that have already been implemented at the World Bank. What is the next series of asks? And so that discussion is being had right now. Prime Minister will comment on this next week at the SIDS conference in Antigua and Barbuda.
And SIDS stands for Small Island Developing States.
Exactly. So it brings them all together. But, this is a much broader agenda than just small island nations. And so she'll be launching that later this year. So I don't want to steal her thunder, because those dialogues are still going. But I think, that general principle, the world is at a crossroads. And I think what the Prime Minister always brings it back to, that this is not about supporting people in faraway lands. Climate justice is actually for everyone. It's about saving ourselves as well. And we have to act together to save tomorrow. And I think that next stage of the movement, you'll see more about that in the coming months. But it really comes back to that principle and unlocking the financial resources. And so you can expect the narrative to be very strong, but also in line with the insights I've shared from the pause clauses, also being very specific and focused as well.
Well, Mick, we'll have to leave it there. I've been to a few of the Global Citizen Festivals over the year and a big admirer of all that you do. Congrats on the new book. It's great. And thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark. Appreciate it. And thanks for all the work you do in sharing the word. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.